So over the weekend, I saw the new Hunger Games movie, The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, in theaters, and the story was actually fresh in my mind because I had just finished reading the book a day prior. So I wanted to make this video to talk about my general thoughts of the film, its strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, as well as discuss what I think are the most significant differences between the movie and the book. First and foremost, I think they did an excellent job casting the characters, just as they did with the previous movies, Catching Fire, Mockingjay, as well as recreating the setting. Some of these some of the imagery in this movie was like exactly how I had envisioned it in my mind as I was reading the book. It truly is a surreal experience getting to see a story come to life on the big screen that you have just invested so much time in reading over the past few days, few weeks, or however long it took you, right? And that's the main reason why I wanted to read this book before seeing the film, because I wanted to recreate that same exact experience that I had with Catching Fire all those years ago. Now, I won't lie. Going into this movie, I was extremely concerned about how they were going to fit 517 pages worth of content into this 2 hour and 45-minute film. And what we end up getting here, I'd say, was a very faithful adaptation of the book, in the sense that they cover all the major events that occur in the story, but unfortunately this comes at the detriment of the character development. There's just too much ground to cover in so little screen time, and what this means is that we cannot see the shift in worldviews that occurs for the main character over the course of about 2 months, as clearly as we'd be able to see it while reading the book. And I have to agree with YouTuber Penguin Zero here in that this results in a movie that carries a lot less emotional weight than its book counterpart. I thought for sure that I was going to be shedding some tears in the theater that night, so much so that I bring my sunglasses with me just in case. But ultimately I didn't. No tears were shed. And in retrospect, I think the reason for this was because I was so hyper-focused on identifying the differences between the movie and the book. And for good reason. This movie felt like it was just one major event after another, and this left little time to explore and develop the relationships between the characters, specifically between Coriolanus and other main characters like Sejanus, Lucy Gray, and Dr. Gall. And this makes me really wish that The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes had gotten the Mockingjay treatment, with that third installment of the trilogy having been made into two separate movies entirely. I think this adaptation really would have benefited from that, especially given that the story is already set up into 3 parts. I think parts 1 and 2, The Mentor and the Prize, could have been its own movie entirely, with the ending of that film coinciding with the end of the 10th annual Hunger Games and Coriolanus' banishment to District 12. The second movie would then pick up right where it left off, starting on part 3, The Peacekeeper. So much character development happens in that third part of the book, and in the movie, so much is either rearranged or left out entirely. Some characters are never introduced. And for the most part, I think the changes they made throughout the movie were perfectly justified given the time constraint. These changes were typically for one of 3 reasons, either for dramatization, clarity, or time saving, and I can give an example of all 3. The best example I can give of a dramatization that was made in the movie, also for the purposes of time saving, would be the finale of the Hunger Games, where the Rainbow of Death is dropped into the arena and all but one tribute is killed off instantly. Whereas in the book, the finale of the Hunger Games was not nearly as dramatic as that. And there's other countless instances of these time-saving efforts, one of them being Lucy Gray's musical performance for the interview, occurring while Coriolanus was still in the hospital, whereas in the book I'm pretty sure he was standing by her side the entire time. And of course, one major limitation of a movie is the inability to read the character's thoughts like you can in the book. So in order to remedy this, they've altered the dialogue quite a bit in order to more accurately convey the character's thoughts. And one example of this would be when Coriolanus returns from the arena and he basically tells Tigris everything that happened in the arena. But in the book, he's a lot more secretive about it. On the flip side, though, the movie does allow us to see the character's facial expressions, which honestly can tell a story in its own, and actually help me clarify some of the character's actions and thought processes from the book. I could sit here all day and talk about the differences between the book and the movie, but ultimately, I think I've narrowed them down to 3. the three that I think are the most important to the storyline. The first major difference occurs early on in the story, where Coriolanus and his fellow student Clemencia are tasked by Dr. Galt to write a proposal introducing the bedding concept and the drone delivery concept for the Hunger Games. Now, originally in the book, Arachne Crane was supposed to be part of this assignment as well, but for whatever reason in the movie she wasn't. But that's besides the point. When Coriolanus and Clemencia go to Dr. Galt's lab to discuss the assignment, she asks them to retrieve the papers from the Rainbow of Death. And as we know, in the movie, Clemencia goes first and is attacked by the snakes. But Coriolanus never reaches his hand into the snake tank to retrieve the papers like he does in the book. In fact, in the book, he actually is the first one to reach, does not get attacked. Clemencia goes second, and she's attacked. I think this would have gone a long way in demonstrating why the snakes don't attack Lucy Gray in the arena. It would have taken probably 30 seconds or less to include this in this scene in the movie, and it would have also added to the dramatization of the movie. So I'm not sure whose decision it was to not include that, but either way, Clemencia is also completely written off after this scene. In fact, like, you never hear from her ever again, whereas in the book, her and Coriolanus end up reuniting in the hospital, and she starts to express her distrust with Coriolanus for not telling the other students and her parents the reason why she was truly in the hospital. Also, I almost forgot to mention, when Dr. Gull announces on live TV that she's going to be dropping the Rainbow of Death into the arena as punishment for the president's son or nephew dying in the bombing, Coriolanus immediately knows to go to her lab and sneak Lucy Gray's tissue into the tank. In the book, it just so happened he was in Dr. Gull's office for another reason when he encountered the tank in the elevator on his way out, and he made a very spontaneous decision to sneak Lucy Gray's tissue into the tank. Now, in the movie, like I mentioned, he goes straight for the lab for this exact reason. But how could he have been so confident that the snakes wouldn't attack her? Because in the movie, he hadn't had that experience himself of reaching his hand into the tank and proving that the snakes wouldn't attack him because they're familiar with his scent. Again, I don't know why they didn't include that scene in the movie. But enough of the snakes. Let's move on to the next key difference between the book and the movie, and that has to do with the Mockingjays in part 3. So there's almost no explanation provided for how Coriolanus and Sejanus get in a predicament where they're moving these Mockingjays and Jabberjays into a truck, and Coriolanus is able to make the spontaneous decision to record Sejanus' confession. However, in the book, the explanation is that Coriolanus proposed the idea to his higher-ups in the military to use the Mockingjays as target practice. The idea ends up getting approved by Dr. Gall, and she sends out Dr. K to District 12 to facilitate this process. And during this process of capturing 50 birds of each type, he learns from Dr. K, Dr. Gall's assistant, how to properly use the remotes to function the Jabberjays. Whereas in the movie, Coriolanus learns how to use the Jabberjay remotes while in the Capitol at Dr. Gall's lab, which again is a perfectly acceptable change to make for time-saving purposes. But what it leaves out is Coriolanus' pure revulsion for these birds, which, given that this is a prequel of the Hunger Games trilogy, and Katniss becomes known as the Mockingjay, the symbol of the revolution, this is kind of a key element of Snow's backstory that is completely left out. But either way, the outcome is the same. He uses the birds, he uses the Jabberjays to record Sejanus' confession, which ultimately gets him killed. But I think they could have elaborated more on why Coriolanus hates the Mockingjays so much. And I think it's explained perfectly on page 504, where Collins writes, "He collapsed on the ground, dizzy and nauseous, as the woods exploded. Every bird of every kind screaming its head off, while the Mockingjays continued their rendition of the hanging tree. Nature gone mad, genes gone bad, chaos." For Coriolanus, the Mockingjays are the embodiment of chaos, because they were a byproduct of the Jabberjays and Mockingbirds, the former of which the Capitol once had control over during the wartime, but eventually lost control over, which resulted in overpopulation of both Jabberjays and the Mockingjays. And if we know anything about Coriolanus, is that chaos needs to be controlled, is his fundamental belief, which is instilled on him from Dr. Gall, which ultimately leads me to my most important difference between the book and the movie. Now, it's no secret that one of the most prominent themes explored in this book is the idea of nature versus nurture. I happen to have the Barnes & Noble edition of this book, which includes an author Q&A at the end where Suzanne Collins discusses some of her philosophical inspirations for the book, including the works of John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, and Jean Rousseau. It's here that she explains that characters like Lucy Gray and Sejanus were meant to embody the beliefs of Locke and Rousseau, specifically that humans in the state of nature are morally neutral and relatively peaceful. It's in this primitive state preceding socialization where traits like envy, pride, and the fear of others are practically non-existent. And I think Lucy Gray echoes this perfectly in the book, and also in the movie, where she says, "People aren't so bad, really. It's what the world does to them." Dr. Gall, on the other hand, very much holds a Hobbesian belief that the state of nature is characterized by a constant state of war, violence, and competition. And she makes every attempt to instill this belief onto Coriolanus, first by sending him into the arena, then by banishing him to District 12, but also through an individual writing assignment that she assigns to him about halfway through the book. In the end, she succeeds in indoctrinating Coriolanus into this worldview, thereby convincing him that humanity needs an absolute authority to rule at the expense of personal freedom. And this authority, of course, should be the capital. Throughout the book, we get an inside look into Coriolanus' internal struggle that we don't get in the movie, specifically in regards to his attempts to separate Lucy Gray from the district label, as she seems to deviate from his Hobbesian view of district citizens as barbaric and brutish. But I would argue that Coriolanus' internal struggle reaches its peak after his visit in the arena, and even thereafter in Dr. Gall's lab when she reveals to him the true reason for sending him in there, and then asks him to elaborate on one of his essay assignments. So in the book, Dr. Gall asks all the students to write an essay about what they liked about the war, and the essay that Coriolanus ends up writing consists of mostly surface level stuff. But he mentions something near the end that ends up drawing Dr. Gall's attention, and then she asks him to elaborate on what he eventually calls the 3 C's: chaos, control, and contract. I'll read an excerpt from the book on page 244. Until that bit in the end, the part about control. For your next assignment, I'd like you to elaborate on that. The value of control, on what happens without it. Take your time with it, but it might be a nice addition to your prize application. Coriolanus knew what happened without control. He's seen it recently, at the zoo when Arachne died, in the arena when the bombs went off, and then again tonight. Chaos happens. What else is there to say? Oh, a good deal, I think. Start with that. Chaos, no control, no law, no government at all. Like being in the arena. Where do we go from there? What sort of agreement is necessary if we're to live in peace? What sort of social contract is required for survival? I believe this seals the deal for Coriolanus and only reinforces in his mind the lesson Dr. Gall attempted to teach him through his experience in the arena. Now, I'm by no means an expert on this subject matter, but the social contract she refers to here is a form of organized government that allows individuals to leave the state of nature and enter a civil society. And in Coriolanus' mind, the state of nature will always be a threat looming in the background, and it will return as soon as the government were to collapse. And this could be why he places such a high value on having power over people, and why he himself could never live in a state of nature, even if he hadn't found the murder weapons. Lastly, before I go, I wanted to point out something else interesting I found in the author Q&A. Suzanne Collins explains that she had already developed Lucy Gray's character before she had even decided on her name, and her name was ultimately inspired by a poem by Wordsworth that we read in the book. But she also mentions that the mystery of Lucy Gray's fate was intentional, because it would leave a question to address later on if she decides to fill out more of the world of Panem. Those are her words. I've been reading a lot of discussion online about how people want to see Haymitch's backstory, Finnick's backstory, or even Joanna's backstory. Me, personally, I would love to see a Plutarch Havensby backstory, and I'll tell you why. I'm particularly interested in seeing how this man managed to get into the position of head game maker. Honestly, I think he did what Sejanus should have done, but couldn't bring himself to do. Use his status and wealth to his advantage to eventually get himself into a position of power and then overthrow the government from the inside, I think that makes for a very interesting story. That's going to be it for today's video, folks. I hope I've at least given you something to think about. I may or may not make a follow-up video elaborating on other topics of interest relating to this book. If I do, it'll be after I see the movie for a second time, and I really hope that my second time seeing the movie will be more enjoyable than the first, because I won't be as hyper-focused on trying to identify the differences between the two. If you haven't read this book and don't plan on reading it, I would still highly recommend seeing the movie, because what is ultimately presented on screen is still a complete story, albeit with a few minor details rearranged or omitted. I took my girlfriend to see the movie, and she seemed to really enjoy it despite not having read the book. I, on the other hand, think my enjoyment was inhibited by having read the book, and which really surprised me. But either way, I'm glad the movie exists, and I can't wait to see it many more times once it becomes available on streaming platforms. But that just about covers everything for today. Thank you guys for watching, and have a wonderful day.